Welcome to the program. Today we are going to discuss the question of reform in education. In all parts of the world, discussions are taking place about the need to provide greater opportunities for access to education and to ensure that its quality remains very high. Some people have said that if this is to take place, then distance education has a particular contribution to make. We are fortunate to have with us for this discussion three eminent educators. We have Professor Kulandaswamy, who is Vice Chancellor of the Indira Gandhi National Open University in India, and Dr. Mohammed Bunza, who is Director of the National Teachers Institute in Nigeria. And finally, we have Dr. John Daniel, who is Vice Chancellor of the British Open University, which has established quite a reputation in this field and which many countries look to for guidance and direction. I wonder if we could begin with Professor Kulandaswamy. Professor Kulandaswamy, what is your view of this question of the role that distance education might play in the reforms which are being contemplated?
Well, Mr. Chairman, it's a good question as far as India is concerned, and maybe for all the developing countries. I may put the problems facing India under three categories. One, problems of literacy. Two, problems of lifelong education. And three, problems of equity and social justice. If you take India today, about 48% of the population is still illiterate. Even taking into account the teachers who are already in service, around 360,000 teachers are untrained. And if we are to achieve universalization, the number of teachers who ought to be trained would be immense. The conventional system is not in a position to meet this challenge. While on one side we have the problem of illiteracy, India is a country which today has the third largest scientific and technological manpower. The number would be around 4 million. And you know, Mr. Chairman, in the field of science and technology, half-life of knowledge is 5 years or less. Even if you are to upgrade or broaden or improve the competence of these people once in 5 years, India has to handle about 800,000 people each year. The conventional system cannot meet this requirement. The country has a vast network of higher education, 190 universities and 7,000 colleges. But you would be surprised to know that only 6% of the age group is in the university system. 94% is outside. And again, this 6% comes, 80% of it from the top 20% of the population.
I see. Dr. Bunza, you are involved, you have been for many years, in teacher education.
That's right.
Indeed, the mandate of your institution was specifically for improving teacher training.
Yes.
Clearly, if education is to be reformed, then the training of teachers is seminal to the whole exercise. Would you like to share your views with us on this?
Well, I thought, Mr. Chairman, at the very beginning, our case with India seemed to be quite similar. In fact, with the dearth of education all over the African continent in particular, and then Nigeria in general, we find the topic of teacher education as discussed in the previous month. You'll find that a lot of problems are still being worked out, and there is no way the conventional system of education will solve our problems. We have dealt with conventional universities. A lot of them have been open, but we realize that to date they could not get up to a third of the eligible candidates going to the university being admitted for the university education. And we felt it's a waste of manpower if these candidates who could not go into the universities, could not find an alternative place. Therefore, the only way out is to develop the question of distance education. That's why we have taken the lead in Nigeria to ensure that we establish a National Teachers Institute, so that we'll give more emphasis on the development of teachers that will enhance the problems of study centers and other operating facilities all over the country. And we hope with this establishment we'll be able to come up with the number of teachers that may be required to assist in the distance learning, not necessarily in the conventional system. And I feel this is a necessity. We have to achieve our development.
That's very interesting. We have had a view from Asia and another from Africa. Dr. Daniel, you've had a long and very varied, extended history, experience in distance education in a number of countries. I wonder if you'd like to reflect with us on the European experience, perhaps.
I think the focus of the present reforms in Europe really has three thrusts. First of all, expansion. Second, reduction of cost. And third, what I would call integration. Expansion simply means expansion in student numbers. I'm talking particularly at the university level, where in Britain the aim is to double the numbers within 10 years. They also want to reduce the cost because they don't intend to double the resource going into higher education. And I think a result of both those is this phenomenon of integration, where they don't want distance education to develop separately from the rest of the system. They want the whole thing to be seen as a higher education system. And then students themselves can move between one and the other. So another aspect of the integration is also the much greater interest of European governments, and indeed the European community generally, in emphasis not just on education but on training. And that goes particularly for the 16 to 18-year-olds, which in many European countries are now considered to be perhaps the greatest educational challenge, to get the stay-on rates in education and training up to the levels that we see in parts of Asia, that is to say people staying in education and training up until 18 and 19.
I was very interested in your comment that in the European context, as I'm sure it must be in other contexts, people believe that it may be more economic, if I can put it that way, that is, in responding to the demands for access, that it is perhaps felt that distance education may be, shall we say, a less expensive alternative. Perhaps we should spend a moment on that, because it may not do justice to distance education to project it as cheaper, but rather to project it as more cost-effective. What do you think of that, Professor Kulunaswamy?
Well, when it comes to distance education, I wouldn't merely call it as a reform in education. Mr. Chairman, it is a new form in education. From the time we had the industrial civilization, every area of activity has used technology and increased productivity. But surprisingly, the classroom instruction has remained a craft. The productivity of the conventional system has not improved in the last 2 centuries. For the first time, I should say, distance education symbolizes the transformation of education from craft to technology, and therefore we are in a position to improve the productivity of education. So it's not a matter of cheap education, but a methodology that improves productivity, and therefore it is cost effective. That's the way I would look at the problem.
I see. So that you would argue, I believe, if I understand you correctly, that it may initially require a greater outlay, but you believe that the returns will certainly be greater.
Precisely so.
Yes. Dr. Bunza, what is the African situation?
Well, in the African perspective, Mr. Chairman, the cost effectiveness of distance education is definitely there at the very beginning. And I believe in the long run, as we have done it in the National Teachers Institute and other institutions that we have come across during our conferences, I found that definitely you will have an input for cost effectiveness some years after the establishment. And the reform that we are talking of, distance education, certainly giving the opportunity to those who have not got the opportunity to be in the school areas and now finding it taken to their doorsteps has helped quite a lot in getting our rural area in particular being accepted into the system of education. And we believe that it has done a lot to achieve our objective.
Thank you. Well, Dr. Daniel, you raised the issue of cost effectiveness. Would you like to elaborate on that?
I think the tremendous difference between distance education and conventional education is that with conventional education, as it gets bigger, the quality usually goes down.
That's right.
Whereas with distance education, as it gets bigger, the quality should go up because you can invest more. It would be nice if governments were interested in cost effectiveness, but I think in fact they tend to be interested in cost, period. And there's no question that the government of the United Kingdom is integrating the Open University into the university network generally because they know that we cost 2/3 as much per graduate as the conventional system, and they hope that competition from us will make the conventional system drive its costs down.
Yes. I think we are agreed, all, at least three of you are, that we should not proceed in the belief that it will necessarily be cheap. As you say, Dr. Daniel, as the numbers increase, then unit costs and so on go down. But I'm at pains, I think, to make sure that our readers do not get the, or listeners rather, do not get the impression that we can get away with good quality distance education on the cheap. I was also very interested in the observation about integration. There are many people who are expressing concerns about the development of distance education institutions, separate and apart, as it were. And there's a strong case being made now, as you've said, for integrating the techniques which are associated with distance very much more into the conventional as well. And that seems to be a direction that many countries are giving serious consideration to. Professor Kundaswamy, what is the Indian experience on this?
Well, India has a fairly long experience in this regard. We have today more than 40 universities that offer education under the distance education mode, and I presume that this number will grow rather fast. I may put it in a philosophical term. The concept of classical responsibility of a university was preservation of knowledge, creation of knowledge, and communication of knowledge. But today the society demands that the university should also have extension and development as one of the objectives. If this objective is to be fulfilled even by the conventional universities, they have to use the distance education mode. I don't see any alternative. So therefore, according to my expectation, India will have more and more conventional universities making use of distance education mode to meet some of the legitimate objectives that the society has placed on them.
Dr. Bunza, in India at the moment, so far as we know, there are about 5 open universities. But there does not appear to be an open university anywhere in Africa, with the possible exception of South Africa, where there is some work done at UNICEF. What is happening in the African context?
Well, I think our experiences in distance learning, or distance education for in particular, is not really as it is in Europe or even in India itself. They have gone far ahead of us in this context. But we realize the problem of scholarship. And because of that, a lot of African countries are now taking distance education as part of the dual role in the university system. You take, for example, Abuja in Nigeria. The government has established a university which has a dual role, the both conventional and the distance learning system. And in Ghana also, there was a plan for that type of university, where distance education is going to be part of the university. In the past, what was happening that they created departments for extramural studies, and they try on that respect to assist those who are interested. But the scope of extramural studies cannot go to the level of education that is being aimed for by people nowadays. Therefore, the only alternative is to get the distance education in the university system. And the universities mostly now are thinking of the dual role. And I believe in East Africa, because we had a seminar with them, they too are thinking of the same way that Nigeria is thinking, to establish universities with dual role. If you take the university system in Nigeria, we have 30 universities, but it's only one that has got such dual role of distance education and the conventional system. All others are on conventional basis, and where you find you have to provide accommodation for the students. The facilities are not there, and government cannot continue to do that. Therefore, the only alternative is to make sure that we do open a reform system which will accommodate more of the students coming into the system.
That's a very interesting experience. Of course, you are aware that in Tanzania at the moment, consideration is being given to the establishment of an open university. And in Kenya, for some years, the University of Nairobi has virtually operated in dual mode. Dr. Daniel, while in your present life, you are Vice Chancellor of the British Open University, just prior to that, you virtually ran a dual mode institution at Laurentian. Can you share your experience on that aspect with us?
Yes, I think really the point is that the way in which you integrate distance education and conventional education depends on the country you're working in. We're looking here at the country of India, which has nearly 1 billion people, right. Nigeria, which has well over 100 million. Even the UK with 55 million is a relatively large country. And in those cases, I think it makes sense to have a distance university, but to facilitate movement of students. But recently I was hearing about education in the Seychelles, where the population is less than 100,000. And clearly it doesn't make sense to have an open university of the Seychelles. But I think your own Commonwealth of Learning has been doing marvelous work in helping those smaller states benefit from what is available elsewhere. And at Laurentian, where we were facing perhaps a population of 2 million in Northern Ontario, again, an open university didn't make sense, but we could get added value out of our professoriate by having them prepare courses at a distance as well as doing their normal classroom work.
We were talking about distance a moment ago in terms of the varieties of the countries. Some, as you say, like India or Nigeria or even Britain. Within the Commonwealth context anyway, there's a very large number of very small countries. And the view has been expressed in some places, what does distance education have to do for them? I was asked in Barbados recently, why should we have distance education? We can cover the whole country in half a day. I'm sure that there are some particular advantages in trying to reform those systems to draw on distance education techniques. Dr. Daniel, can you help us with that?
Yes, well, interestingly, I was sent by the Commonwealth of Learning to Mauritius in 1989, and Mauritius is an island almost circular with a radius of about 15 kilometers. And the first question they asked me was, what has distance education got to do with Mauritius? And I tried to explain that if you think of distance education as all forms of education where you don't require one teacher displaying the information to a class at the same time, then in fact it becomes quite a flexible concept. You're looking not only at physical distance, you'll look at moving over time, you're looking at enabling a local teacher to teach a much wider range of courses than he or she could do by themselves by bringing in, through forms of media, print, television, radio, outside expertise. And I think that it also helps to expand the whole thrust of a country's education system. So I think that they're finding that this has a lot to offer them.
The Mauritius example you gave is a very good one, because for 25 years they had a limited number of faculties or departments, and they have only been able to expand those, to introduce new programs as a result of taking courses from elsewhere and modifying and adapting and so on. I wonder if we might spend a moment or two on the technologies, telecommunications side. People are beginning to think of distance education now as only worth doing if we have access to these technologies. Professor Kundaswamy, what is India's experience in this, or what is your own view of it?
Well, if I am to take Indira Gandhi National Open University as an example, our dependence today is substantially on print material as well as counseling in what we call the counseling sessions in various study centers.
Yes.
We do make use of audio and video cassettes at the study centers and broadcast and telecast our programs. But I should say at this point of time, it is supplementary, not even complementary. For the subjects that we offer, the use of print material and counseling has been doing well. But we are moving into technology, health sciences, and computers. Once we depend on skill development, I think the use of communication becomes very important. It would be more effective than print material.
You're a scientist yourself, and quite an accomplished one. What do you think about teaching the technical areas and the need for the technologies to be harnessed in terms of delivering that kind of education?
I have devoted some thought to the effectiveness of distance education in the field of science and technology. I have come to the conclusion that there should be no reservation whatsoever as far as the competence of distance education in the field of engineering and technology. It would only mean that you may possibly have to use more devices, a better strategy, and think in terms of training centers and workplaces, a combination of distance education as well as face-to-face instruction when it comes to technology.
I see. Dr. Bunza, you have a wide network of student support centers, for example.
That's right.
How do you keep in touch with these? How?
Well, in our own case, what we start to do is to establish the radio communication
Yes.
throughout the states within the Federation. And then through these radio communications, we try as of now to establish a link with the national network of the Federal Radio Corporation of Nigeria so as to broadcast some of our materials. Otherwise, the print material has dominated our distance education system most of the time. But we felt this is not good enough, particularly for those who are very far in the rural areas. We have got some part of riverine areas, difficult areas, where you can find the print material takes time before it goes, even though we have got study centers nearby.
We understand that in West Africa,
Yes.
there are moves afoot for using satellite, the Vita satellite, for linking these four countries in a particular way.
In fact, that's what I'm coming to. So
Yes.
that's what we are looking forward to. In fact, we were in touch with the Commonwealth of Learning, and there was such assurance that it is coming, and the Vita satellite will be placed at National Teachers Institute Kaduna in Nigeria so that it can serve the West African Commonwealth countries. In fact, we had a meeting in Kaduna over this issue, and we felt this could be an effective measure if our programs are to be of qualitative type that we expect it to be. Because we believe the print materials that we are developing them now, if they are supported by such technology, we will get a long way. And that's what
You think the quality will be higher?
we hope. Yes.
Dr. Daniel, the Open University in Britain, anyway, has developed an enormous reputation for using modern technologies in terms of delivery systems, for example. Would you like to share your experience with us?
Yes, I think the first point I'd make is that they're not necessarily state-of-the-art modern,
Yes.
because we try and rely on the technologies that the students themselves have. I perhaps distinguish three levels. First of all, the mass media, television and radio,
That's right.
where I think almost the biggest advantage is the non-students that you reach.
Yes.
Each week in Britain, about 5 million people tune in at some point to an Open University program, which is vastly bigger than our number of students. And I think that's a useful service to the community. Secondly, I'd mention personal media, which I mean the media that the student uses at home. Audio cassettes we've had great success with, and now video cassettes. But of course, they are no longer reaching the whole wide community. And I think the one of the future, which we're just beginning to grapple with, are interactive media, where the student is linked into a computer at home, and that computer is linked over a telephone line to other students and to the university. And I think what that does is to put, it has the potential at least of putting back in distance education the sense of a community of learners, which some people criticize distance learning for having lost.
Yes. In fact, as you mentioned students, I'm reminded that we ought to have a word about them, because they are, after all, at the heart of the entire system. The reforms that we have talked about a little tended to focus on the normal student, the regular student, the person who goes on to higher education, shall we say. But the whole business of lifelong learning and upgrading and continuing professional education seems to be an area in which distance education techniques has a particular contribution to make. What is the situation in India?
I think when it comes to lifelong education, distance education is the only method that is available, because these men and women will not be able to come into the classroom and spend a few months. So they have to remain in service and still get the benefit of either upgrading or updating their knowledge. If you take India, for instance, the most popular program that we have today is in the field of management. All these people are already employed. Another program that we have is in the field of library science. Again, these are people who are already employed in the library. And as I said earlier, we are contemplating 2 degree programs in the field of engineering and technology. And these are for people who are diploma holders in engineering and who are already serving in the field. So in my opinion, the most important development during the course of the 20th century is the rapid obsolescence of knowledge and the inevitable need that people have to be continuously educated if they are to perform with any degree of competence. I don't see any other alternative to distance education as far as this particular target group is concerned.
Well, the whole of your mandate, Dr. Bunza, in a sense, is professional continuing.
That's right.
In that with teachers, it's not simply the pre-service and so on, but it's a question of keeping them upgraded on a continuing basis. Are there any other areas, apart from teacher education, in which some work is being done, say with nurses or judges and so on?
In the area of higher education, yes, we have got so many universities that have got departments where they continue with what I term as either language courses, but they call it distance education in actual sense. And this has helped a lot in other areas of profession. But the government realized that we are not only in need of the higher education, and as such, our communication has been set, which is called the Math Literacy Commission, it's a commission. Math Literacy Commission, and it has taken the aspect of all those from the lower level up to the tertiary level of education to assist them in whichever professional field is possible within Nigeria.
I see.
And I believe some of the countries in West Africa are buying the idea that Nigeria has proposed. It is now working all right in Nigeria with the Math Literacy Commission. But the universities are taking ahead with the higher education in degree places and others like that.
Dr. Daniel, you'll be aware, of course, not only in Europe but elsewhere, of the use being made of distance education techniques in this general area of professional upgrading. Any specific examples you want to draw to our attention?
Well, I think the thing that's taken us a bit by surprise and is becoming very important in the UK and Europe generally is that the former sort of bilateral relationship between the student and the institution is changing into a triangular one where the employer wants to get involved.
That's right. Yes.
I'm not talking about the employer wanting a course specifically for his industry. I'm talking about an employer who, even when we're teaching a standard management course, wants to perhaps have one of his staff as the tutor for the group, wants access to the students' marks, which of course is a very touchy issue.
Yes.
But we decided we really have to come to terms with this and see the thing as a triangular relationship, because after all, often it's the employer who is paying the fees for these students. So we're beginning to discover that professional development is an extremely engaging process, which is taking the university in quite new directions.
Gentlemen, we've spent a little time, I think, focused very largely on higher education, professional breeding. But the reforms in education, which many countries are concerned with, apply to primary, they apply to the secondary levels and to the sub-degree, the technical vocational area and so on. Perhaps we should reflect for a moment on what distance education might do in those areas as well. Let us start with Dr. Bunza this time. In terms of the contribution, for example, 2 years ago, there was a major meeting about basic education for all. And it's very difficult for people like me to see how we can provide basic education for all unless we make use of these techniques. Can you reflect on that with us?
Well, we have discussed this issue on distance education at the lower level, but we found at the moment we are not prepared for it, quite honestly, in Nigeria and other parts of the West African countries. We are not prepared for it in a sense that we have not tackled properly at the higher level system. So what we are thinking, or what it's been on now, are for people to establish private schools which will cater for the education for all. A lot of private schools have sprung up so far as to come up to town with education for all as it's been prepared. But at the distance level, we have not gone into that stage yet. And I believe it will take quite some time because we want to find our feet on what we are planning now for teacher education.
I see.
Because we thought even if we start, we have not got enough teachers to do that. So the National Teachers Institute have given this assignment. By 1998, we should get the qualified teachers teaching in primary schools and also in other sectors of private education within the country. So perhaps it will be only after that we are thinking of distance education.
But you are thinking about it?
Yes, we are thinking about it certainly, but we are not capable of implementing it.
You don't think you're quite ready yet?
No, we are not yet ready.
Professor Kulanaswamy, you mentioned the high level of illiteracy. Now, clearly, if we're to make any significant impact on that problem in India, the techniques we're talking about are going to have to be used more extensively.
Well, if you take India and the problems of literacy, sometimes many people think that it is a matter of funds. To me, it is not so much a matter of funds being available, it's a matter of manpower being available. And some of our conventional universities have introduced Bachelor of Education programs as far as India is concerned. But it requires perhaps a certain improvement in standard.
I see.
So, from Indira Gandhi National Open University, in collaboration with the provincial open universities, we are thinking in terms of a common B.Ed program, which would be with minor variations depending upon the core being the same, that we would try to introduce in order that we will meet this demand, which even today is acute and would become more acute in future when the present emphasis on literacy takes shape.
Thank you. Dr. Daniel, drawing on your previous experience, especially with developing countries, the case is often made that the level of education which really needs to have an injection and interest and so on is the technical vocational. But it is precisely that kind of education that people have expressed doubts about whether distance education can really make a contribution there. Could you share your experience with us on that particular problem?
I think one of the most optimistic things is that recently distance education has made tremendous strides in establishing its credibility in technical education. We all know the old jokes about you wouldn't want to fly with an airline pilot who'd done a correspondence course or have your brain operated by a neurosurgeon who'd learnt his his work at a distance. But I think what people are discovering is that even in brain surgery and flying planes, a great deal of the learning can in fact be done by distance education techniques. Before they let someone up in a Boeing 747, that person spends hours in simulators, which in a way are a distance education technique. So I think what we're coming towards is a situation where the very expensive hands-on equipment-based technical education can be done in a much more efficient way, and much of the preparatory cerebral learning, if you like, that goes into that is done at a distance.
Well, you'll be very interested to hear that the Commonwealth of Learning has just commissioned the Institute of Technology in India, the one in Delhi, to put before us the simulations which they believe would be useful for particular industrial processes, so we can build in to some of our courses. Gentlemen, we are running out of time. I have one more question for you, and I need a rapid answer. Clearly, education has to be revitalized. It would seem to some of us that the revitalization which is required is going to have to be driven by some things. Some people say that that is only going to happen with a wider use of these technologies we're talking about. Can I get a short reaction from each of you to that?
Well, Mr. Chairman, I have some radical views in this regard. Some refer to distance education either as a supplement or a complement or an alternative to conventional system. To me, it is a new stage of education by itself. It has its own target groups, it has its own program of education, and I should say that distance education addresses itself to those questions, those challenges, and those target groups for which the conventional system has not been designed, and the conventional system is inadequate. So therefore, I see a totally new role covering a much larger number of people, and I might add that as we have today multinational corporations, we shall have, by the time we reach the end of this century, multinational distance education institutions.
Well, I can see Dr. Bunza nodding vigorously, and so is Dr. Daniel, so I take it that they share the views you have expressed. May I thank you very warmly for giving us your time. Clearly, what we have said will stimulate a great deal of thinking in education circles and elsewhere, and I'm grateful to you all for being here and for being as generous with your experience. Thank you very much.
Thank you.